on a dusty track in southern Tunisia. During the spring of 1943, an armored column belonging to German forces found itself exposed. Allied fighter bombers had descended upon it, leaving behind a devastation that still smoldered the following day when ground troops arrived. Twisted chassis rails, turrets ripped open on panzers, and a kitchen trailer reduced to skeletal remains marked the path of destruction. Curiously, there were no artillery craters, no signs of engagement on the ground, indicating the attack had come solely from the air, delivered with precision from low altitude. A high-ranking German commander, at that moment away from the front on sick leave in Germany, would grasp the full implications of these scenes even before reviewing the photographic evidence. He had been witnessing this slow erosion of capability for half a year. His private writings and correspondence with his wife, Lucy, later revealed an uncompromising professional assessment of his own failures. He described the predicament of fighting an enemy with absolute control of the skies as akin to a primitive warrior facing a modern European army, under similar constraints and with an equivalent chance of victory. This stark observation, recorded in personal notes, would later find its way into print. His widow, Lucy, and former chief of staff, Fritz Bayerlein, published these reflections in 1950, presenting them as War Without Hate. 3 years later, these same insights were expanded and translated into a more comprehensive volume by the British military strategist B.H. Liddell Hart, working alongside Lucy, their son Manfred, and Bayerlein, resulting in what became known as the Rommel Papers. This collection also contained a particular pronouncement that would eventually echo through the ranks of American air power officers. The commander wrote that the overwhelming Allied air superiority had nullified all the tactical principles he had so successfully employed in the past. In every future engagement, he concluded, the combined strength of Anglo-American air forces would prove to be the decisive factor. Such language reveals a seasoned professional dissecting a battlefield condition that had rendered his long-proven methods obsolete. This was the same man who, in June 1942, had shattered the British lines at Gazala, pushing the Eighth Army almost to the very borders of Egypt in mere weeks. By the close of that same year, however, this experienced commander had come to a profound realization. The fundamental nature of modern warfare had irrevocably shifted. To understand how this insight dawned upon him, and why it arrived too late for him to effectively counter it, we must examine the campaign that brought him to this point. Our focus shifts from the popular image of grand tank battles in the desert dunes to a different, equally critical version of events: the struggle that unfolded overhead. What follows is an account of how the United States Army Air Forces, operating as a junior partner within a joint Anglo-American Air Command honed over 2 bitter years by seasoned British and Australian desert veterans, systematically dismantled the Afrika Korps from the sky. It details not only the precise observations of that commander as Allied aircraft decimated his panzers in Africa, but also why this experience continued to occupy his thoughts for the remainder of his life. The essential irony of this narrative is that this commander, Erwin Rommel, had never been skeptical of air power. During the 1940 French campaign, his 7th Panzer Division achieved its remarkable speed partly because Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers responded to his requests in real time. Upon his deployment to Libya in February 1941, tasked with salvaging the precarious Italian position, he anticipated a similar level of integrated air support. For approximately 18 months, this expectation was largely met. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons operated from forward desert airfields. Messerschmitt 109s protected convoys crossing the Mediterranean. Junkers 87 dive bombers directly supported divisional commanders. At the zenith of the Axis position in the summer of 1942, after Rommel had captured Tobruk on June 21st and been promoted to Field Marshal the very next day at 50 years of age, the Luftwaffe in North Africa maintained local air superiority over any sector where he launched an attack. The real challenge emerged in the subsequent 5-month period. It was not that the Luftwaffe itself declined in capability, but rather that the opposing air force transformed into something the Axis had never before encountered. The man largely responsible for this profound alteration was an officer of Australian birth and New Zealand upbringing, whose name remains unfamiliar to many. This individual, Arthur Coningham, was born in Brisbane in January 1895. His family relocated to New Zealand during his childhood, and he entered the Great War in 1914 with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force at Gallipoli. When illness forced an end to his infantry service, he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. There, he adopted the nickname Maori, a name later misheard and permanently recorded as Mary. Over the next 2 decades, he forged a reputation as one of the Royal Air Force's most innovative tactical minds. In July 1941, he assumed command of the Western Desert Air Force, the RAF's tactical air arm tasked with supporting the British Eighth Army in Egypt and Libya. Across the next 18 months, amidst a series of setbacks, he systematically developed a doctrine that would endure far beyond his own command. This doctrine was deceptively simple, which perhaps explains why its full potential took so long to be realized. It stipulated that an Air Force engaged alongside an army on a modern battlefield must function as a single, theater-wide instrument of war, not merely as a collection of localized squadrons distributed to corps commanders for isolated protection. It demanded adherence to 3 strict, sequential priorities. First, achieving air superiority by neutralizing the enemy air force both in the sky and on the ground. Second, executing deep interdiction against the enemy's rear supply lines, targeting their depots, rail junctions, and armored formations while they were still in transit. Only then, with these first 2 objectives secured, could it provide direct support to ground troops. This sequence, he insisted, could never be inverted. Initiating close support operations before securing air superiority would inevitably lead to aircraft losses to enemy fighters, leaving the infantry unsupported and vulnerable. Halting at interdiction without first dominating the skies would render the entire campaign unsustainable. Superiority, interdiction, close support, in precisely that order. Coningham did not conceive these principles in isolation. Rather, he forged them through 2 years of intense trial and error within the harsh environment of the Western Desert. He collaborated closely with Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, who took charge of RAF Middle East Command in June 1941. Tedder and Coningham spent much of late 1941 battling the entrenched British Army command structure as much as the Luftwaffe. The prevailing assumption within the Eighth Army at that time dictated that air units should be fragmented and assigned to corps and divisional commanders for immediate support. Every attempt at this fragmented approach had resulted in the piecemeal loss of aircraft on missions the ground forces perceived as urgent, while simultaneously allowing Axis air forces free rein in the rear areas. Tedder and Coningham persistently challenged this paradigm. By the autumn of 1941, during Operation Crusader, they finally established the critical principle that air assets would remain under a unified air commander, with the Army commander defining overall priorities, but not dictating individual sorties. This principle, however, took root gradually. It remained a subject of ongoing debate even as the Eighth Army suffered a severe defeat at Gazala in May 1942. Coningham articulated the fully developed version of this doctrine in a formal address in Tripoli on February 16, 1943. The audience for this address included many senior American and British air officers in the theater, notably Tedder himself, Carl Spaatz, and virtually all the tactical air commanders who would eventually oversee the final stages of the North African campaign. The identical principles would later be codified in the United States War Department Field Manual 120, dated July 21, 1943. This American document, while phrased in the formal language of Army regulation, substantially mirrored Coningham's desert-forged lessons, and it would guide Allied tactical air operations throughout the remainder of the war, influencing United States Air Force doctrine for decades thereafter. When American forces first began arriving in the theater during the autumn of 1942, Coningham's message to them was unequivocal. He urged them, in his own words, to profit by all their mistakes and by their successes. They heeded this counsel. On the American side, the officer tasked with implementing this vision was Major General Carl Spaatz, a pilot from the Great War era, known for his cigar-chewing habit, patience, and intense focus. Spaatz assumed command of the Northwest African Air Forces, or NAF, when it was activated on February 18, 1943, with its headquarters established in Algiers. Under his overall authority, the Strategic Bombing Component, designated the Northwest African Strategic Air Force, or NASAF, was led by Major General James Doolittle, the very man who, less than a year prior, had commanded the daring carrier launch raid on Tokyo. Separate commanders oversaw the tactical and coastal air forces, completing the command structure. Presiding over this entire intricate edifice, as Air Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Air Command, was Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder of the RAF, the same mentor who had fostered Coningham's development and now granted him operational authority over all Allied tactical aviation. For the Axis, this consolidation of power represented the most ominous development imaginable. The Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean had never managed to construct a comparable organizational structure. Its fighters continued to provide close escort for its Stukas, while its Stukas persistently attacked ground targets. Its transport aircraft shuttled vital fuel and personnel across the Sicilian Strait, constantly exposed. Theater commanders, many of them exceptionally skilled, reported through channels that ultimately terminated with Hermann Göring in Berlin. By 1942, Göring had increasingly come to view the Air Force as a mere instrument of his personal political ambitions. Consequently, there existed no theater-wide prioritization doctrine, no strict operational sequence, and no unified command on the Axis side capable of confronting what Coningham and Spaatz were about to unleash. The initial undeniable indication that conditions had fundamentally altered became apparent during the Second Battle of El Alamein, fought between October 23 and November 4, 1942. Yet, the groundwork for this decisive shift had been laid even earlier. In the Battle of Alam Halfa, waged from August 30th to September 5th, 1942, Rommel had launched the last major Axis offensive of the Desert War. British commander Bernard Montgomery, privy to German intentions through decrypted ultra-intercepts, deliberately allowed Rommel's armor to advance into a pre-selected killing ground south of the Alam Halfa Ridge. What ultimately halted the attack, in Rommel's own candid assessment, was the relentless action of the Desert Air Force. Fleet Air Arm albacores illuminated German columns at night with flares, immediately followed by Wellington medium bombers. During daylight, fighter bombers continuously harassed German transport formations. During the first night of the assault, General Walther Nering, commander of the Afrika Korps, sustained wounds in an air raid. The following morning, General George von Bismarck, leading the 21st Panzer Division, was killed when his vehicle struck a British mine within one of the uncleared sectors. Rommel called off the attack on September 2nd. He later recorded that British air superiority had been the decisive element, prompting him, for the first time, to disperse his forces as a defensive measure against aerial assault. He remained unaware that Montgomery had anticipated his maneuvers through intercepted communications. Rommel attributed the outcome solely to the Air Force, when it was in fact a combination of air power and intelligence. Yet, in assigning credit this way, he was more accurate than he knew, as both were manifestations of the same underlying Allied advantage. Adding to this pressure was the strategic position of Malta. Rommel had recognized since early 1941 that this island lay directly across his supply route from Italy, demanding decisive action. For over 2 years, Axis air and naval forces had besieged it, yet it had never ceased to function as a vital Allied air and naval base. Rommel urgently pressed for a full-scale invasion, codenamed Operation Hercules, which Hitler approved in principle in April 1942. However, following the capture of Tobruk in June, Hitler abruptly reversed his decision, and Hercules was canceled. Malta was indeed neutralized as an offensive base through the summer of 1942. But by autumn, the Allies had significantly reinforced it, and Malta was once again operating at full capacity, relentlessly interdicting convoys bound for Libya. When the decisive Battle of El Alamein commenced in late October, the Axis supply crisis in the desert was already, as Rommel privately admitted, beyond remedy. His fuel reserves had dwindled to such an extent that gasoline was being flown in from Crete. When the British offensive began on the evening of October 23rd, Rommel himself was not in Africa. He was recuperating in Sempak, Austria, after months of exhaustion and illness. He returned under direct orders from Hitler, reaching his headquarters on the evening of October 25th, only to confront a situation he could not immediately rectify. Casualties in his forward positions were severe, many not caused by British tanks, but by an unprecedented combination of massed British artillery and continuous air attack. The Desert Air Force, under Cunningham, flew more than 1,000 sorties on several days of the battle. When Rommel ordered armored counterattacks, his columns were spotted in motion and bombed before they could even reach their designated assembly areas. On the night of October 26th, a location the British called Outpost Snipe, on the edge of Kidney Ridge, the 2nd Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, part of the 7th Motor Brigade under the 1st Armored Division, dug in with 19 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Over the next 24 hours, as Rommel personally led successive armored counterattacks to contain the British breakthrough, the Rifle Brigade Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner, held its ground through a day of brutal fighting. Turner himself moved from gun to gun under intense fire. When eventually wounded in the head, he refused evacuation. By the time relief arrived, his battalion had destroyed over 50 Axis armored vehicles, including approximately 32 tanks. Turner was later awarded the Victoria Cross for his courage. This was a remarkable small unit defensive action, made possible in part because Cunningham's aircraft had disrupted German armored reserves before they could fully consolidate. By October 30th, Rommel's effective strength had dwindled to 148 German and 187 Italian tanks, facing roughly 800 British tanks. On November 2nd, he signaled Hitler that the battle was lost. In the letters he dispatched to Lucy during those weeks, the pervasive term was powerlessness. He recounted standing on a ridge, watching his own transport columns burn, acutely aware he lacked both the fuel to move them and the protective fighters overhead. Air superiority, he confided, had fundamentally altered the operational possibilities for a ground commander. He did not yet comprehend that the most severe challenge was still to come. American forces were about to arrive in strength. The landings commenced on November 8, 1942. British and American troops swept ashore in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, nearly 1,800 miles behind Rommel's retreating lines. Hitler's immediate response was to funnel reinforcements into Tunisia by sea and air, a desperate attempt to cling to the last corner of the African continent and prevent a complete collapse of the campaign. By early February 1943, the Axis had concentrated approximately 180,000 troops in the Tunisian bridgehead, a number that would eventually swell to nearly 250,000 before the final capitulation. General Hans-Eugen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army secured the northern sector, while Rommel's battered Panzer Army Africa, in retreat from Egypt, guarded the southern approach. Then came Kasserine, which complicated everything. On February 14, 1943, von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army launched Operation Frühlingswind against American positions at Sidi Bouzid in central Tunisia. The American 1st Armored Division, commanded by Major General Orlando Ward and spread thinly across a wide front, suffered a severe defeat within the first 48 hours. Combat Command A, positioned around Sidi Bouzid itself, was overrun by a coordinated concentric attack from the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions. A counterattack by Combat Command C on February 15th stumbled into the same trap, losing most of its Sherman tanks to concealed German armor. For days later, Rommel himself joined the assault from the south, pushing through the Kasserine Pass with elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, now transferred to his command. By February 20th, his columns had surged through the pass, fanning out in two directions, one towards Thala, where British brigades held their ground, and the other towards Hydra and the critical American supply base at Tebessa. In their first prolonged engagement with the Afrika Korps, the Americans endured the most significant defeat the United States Army would suffer on the Western Front for the duration of the war. Approximately 6,500 American casualties, over 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and vital stocks of fuel, ammunition, and equipment captured at forward depots marked the scale of the disaster. German after-action reports painted a picture of poorly coordinated and tactically rigid Americans, their commanders seemingly incapable of adapting to fluid situations, and their combined arms integration virtually non-existent. Rommel, upon reading these assessments, found them convincing. It reinforced his long-held belief, which he had been relaying to Berlin for months, that the United States Army in the field was not yet a formidable adversary. When he believed his logistics were stretched to their limit, he called off the attack on February 22nd and withdrew back through the pass. The American II Corps, under Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall, reoccupied the vacated ground. Rommel, however, was mistaken, and the reason for his misjudgment lies at the core of this entire account. Kasserine represented the final engagement in the African theater where the Axis enjoyed anything resembling air parity. Within 5 weeks, the aerial balance in the Mediterranean would tip so dramatically that the doctrine forged by Coningham and Spatz would begin to annihilate the Afrika Korps at a rate the Germans simply could not sustain. When that occurred, every principle Rommel had mastered regarding mobile armored warfare would cease to function. The Allied ground response to Kasserine proved equally consequential. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding the theater from Allied Force Headquarters in Algiers, relieved Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall on March 6th, placing Major General George S. Patton in command of the II Corps. Patton arrived at Corps headquarters with explicit orders to restore discipline, a task he undertook with vigor. Uniform regulations were rigorously enforced at every level. Junior officers who had demonstrated laxity were sent home. Combat training resumed in the rear areas, even as the Corps continued its operations. Within 2 weeks, the II Corps had undergone a visible transformation. At the air level, similar reforms were already in motion. The Northwest African Tactical Air Force was formally established on February 18th under Coningham, integrating the American 12th Air Support Command and British Royal Air Force squadrons into a single, combined command, initially headquartered at Constantine in Algeria, later moving to Hydra. Brigadier General Paul L. Williams, Brigadier General Lawrence S. Cuter, and other American officers who had witnessed the early failures of American close air support now operated under Coningham's guiding doctrine, diligently learning to apply its tenets. When American air support re-emerged in March, it did so following the precise 3-priority sequence that had been gradually dismantling the Luftwaffe in the desert since the summer of 1942. The tide began to turn decisively on March 6, 1943, at a town called Medellin in southern Tunisia. Rommel had proposed, a week prior, a spoiling attack against General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army, which was advancing westward from Libya and closing in on the old French Mareth line. His subordinate, Italian General Giovanni Mess, drafted the plan, codenamed Operation Capri. At 6 o'clock in the morning, under the cover of fog, 3 panzer divisions of the Afrika Korps, the 10th, 15th, and 21st, advanced with approximately 150 serviceable tanks and roughly 10,000 infantry. They were, however, expected. Montgomery, alerted to German intentions through ultra-intercepts, had positioned nearly 500 anti-tank guns in concealed enfilade across the open terrain, and his artillery had pre-registered every potential approach. When the fog finally lifted, the German columns found themselves starkly exposed in the desert. At 8:30 that morning, a group of 10 Panzer III tanks, moving towards Tadjikpur, was ambushed by 2 British 6-pounder anti-tank guns, and half of them were destroyed within the opening minutes. Between 9 and 10 a.m., British divisional artillery dispersed German infantry concentrations with ease. The Luftwaffe's attempts to intervene, as stated in the formal after-action report, proved ineffectual against the weight of Allied fighter cover and anti-aircraft defense. By late afternoon, Rommel canceled the attack. His losses for the day amounted to roughly 50 panzers, while British casualties totaled 130 men and 6 tanks. That night, Montgomery dispatched a letter to Field Marshal Alan Brooke in London. The missive, preserved in the British archives, remarked in part that Rommel was attempting to attack him in daylight with tanks followed by hurried infantry, describing it as an absolute gift, and concluding that the man must be mad. What Rommel himself recorded in his papers about Medellin is difficult to fully grasp without understanding the fundamental shift that had occurred within him. That morning, he had committed a third of his armored strength to an assault his own reconnaissance had failed to adequately scout, precisely because he could no longer conduct that reconnaissance from the air. His panzers had been obliterated by anti-tank gun positions that the British had known about for days, positions he could not detect from above because the skies over southern Tunisia now belonged unequivocally to someone else. 3 days later, on March 9th, Rommel departed Africa. He would never return. Officially, his departure was described as sick leave. In reality, he had fruitlessly attempted to persuade Hitler to evacuate the African armies back to Europe before air power irrevocably destroyed them. Hitler refused. Rommel was quietly sidelined, and the destruction he had foretold continued in his absence. The culmination of this destruction began at an oasis village in central Tunisia named El Getter. It opened with a sergeant, under the cold darkness of early morning on March 23, 1943, digging a firing position on a hillside. The unit was the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Herschel D. Baker, attached to Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen's 1st Infantry Division. Their primary weapon was the M3 half-track, an improvised, lightly armored tank destroyer featuring a 75mm gun mounted on its bed, an expedient measure taken because the planned production version was not yet ready. Baker possessed 31 of these vehicles. Behind his lines, a few of the brand-new M10 tank destroyers from the 899th Battalion had just arrived from supply depots across the valley. Meanwhile, the 10th Panzer Division was preparing its own spoiling attack, assembling roughly 50 panzers, 6,000 men, a company of Marder self-propelled guns, and an assault gun battery. Von Arnim, having reviewed the after-action reports from Kasserine, concluded that a sharp German thrust would force the Americans back from the eastern dorsal mountains, thus gaining valuable time. At 6 o'clock that morning, the panzers emerged from the pass. They overran the forward American infantry positions within the first hour. Allen, a Texan cavalryman of the Old Guard, was informed that panzers were closing on his command post and that he should consider relocating. His response, recorded by officers present, has since become part of the division's oral history. He declared that he would, like hell, pull out, and vowed to shoot the first man who did. What followed was a sequence of events the Germans, in every after-action report they filed on El Getter, described with genuine bewilderment. The panzers encountered an American minefield, slowing their advance. As they decelerated, Baker's M3S, firing from concealed positions behind Jebel Kbar, engaged the panzers as they moved along Highway 15, then rapidly displaced and fired again for new positions. Divisional artillery, directed by forward observers hidden in camouflaged posts on the surrounding hills, methodically bracketed the German formation with airburst shells. Tanks of the 10th Panzer Division, deployed across the open desert, were being destroyed by an enemy they simply could not locate. By 9 o'clock in the morning, 30 panzers were burning. By midday, the division had withdrawn. A second attack, launched at 4:45 in the afternoon with fresh infantry, was broken by American artillery within 2 hours. The 601st lost approximately 24 of its vehicles, and the 899th lost 7 of its new M10s. Yet, the 10th Panzer Division, which had shattered the American 1st Armored Division at Kasserine just 5 weeks prior, had been brought to a complete halt by the very same 1st Infantry Division, which many of those panzer crews had dismissed as hopelessly amateurish. Much of the published account of El Getter emphasizes the tank destroyers and the artillery. What is less frequently explained is the critical absence on the German side. The Stukas that should have suppressed the American observation posts were nowhere to be found. The reconnaissance flights that should have pinpointed American positions never flew. The fighter cover that should have protected the 10th Panzer from marauding Allied aircraft was itself engaged elsewhere, being hunted in a different sector during that same week. During the same mornings, the 1st Infantry Division was entrenching itself east of El Getter. Allied fighter groups stationed at El Jem and other Tunisian bases were preparing for an operation that, within 3 weeks, would utterly dismantle the German air bridge into Africa. This operation, codenamed Flax, commenced on April 5, 1943. Its primary instrument was the combined might of the American 12th Air Force's strategic and medium bombardment groups, alongside American fighter groups meticulously trained by the Desert Air Force, and South African squadrons operating in concert. Its target was not the Afrika Korps directly, but the intricate supply system that sustained it. By early April, Allied naval interdiction had severely curtailed Axis shipping, forcing the Germans to transfer most of their Tunisian logistics to air transport. Daily, formations of Junkers 52 transports, immense Messerschmitt 323 cargo aircraft, and Italian Savoy Marchetti 82s traversed the narrow strait between Sicily and Tunisia. At its peak, over 100 such missions flew daily. Through ultra-intercepts, the Allies possessed precise knowledge of German flight schedules. The operation opened at 6:30 on the morning of April 5th with 26 P-38 Lightnings from the 1st Fighter Group, sweeping the Sicilian Strait north of Cape Bon. They intercepted a mixed formation of over 50 Ju-52s, 20 Messerschmitt 109s, 6 Stukas, and 4 Focke-Wulf 190s. In the ensuing aerial combat, the Americans lost 2 P-38s, while the Germans lost 11 transports and 4 fighters. Simultaneously, 18B, 25 Mitchells from the 321st Bomb Group attacked Axis shipping in the strait, sinking 2 seaplane ferries and a destroyer. B. 17 Flying Fortresses of the 97th Bomb Group struck the arrival airfields at Sidi Ahmed and La Goulette in Tunisia. Meanwhile, 35 B-25s from the 310th Bomb Group hit the departure airfield at Gerbini in Sicily, destroying 13 German and 8 Italian aircraft on the ground. The Axis aircraft there had been parked closely together due to a lack of dispersed hard standings, allowing American fragmentation bombs, scattered in a creeping pattern across the parking area, to find their targets with devastating efficiency. This was only the first morning. Day after day, for the next 3 weeks, fighters patrolled the transport lanes at low altitude. Bombers systematically struck airfields in a strict sequence, timed to catch aircraft on the ground both departing and arriving. By April 10th, another 10 Italian transports had been shot down, along with 2 Macchi fighters, in a single engagement with P-38s from the 1st Fighter Group. The rate of attrition became so severe that on the evening of the 18th, only 6 of 65 German transports that had departed Tunis that day managed to return to Sicily. The remainder had been shot down, damaged beyond repair, or forced to crash land along the coast. Göring in Berlin eventually ordered transport flights to Tunisia restricted to night operations only. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring protested, arguing that any supply was preferable to none. The argument, however, had become academic. The transports could no longer fly in daylight and survive. The emblematic moment that signified Operation Flax's decisive impact, the day the German transport force lost any realistic prospect of keeping the African army supplied, occurred on Palm Sunday, April 18, 1943. The 57th Fighter Group, an American unit based at El Jem in Tunisia, had arrived in the Mediterranean theater via an unusual route. The previous July, it had been loaded aboard the aircraft carrier USS Ranger at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. Launched off the Gold Coast on July 19th with 72 P-40F Warhawks, the group had flown across equatorial Africa to Palestine, joined the 9th Air Force, and been attached to No. 211 Group of Coningham's Desert Air Force. These pilots underwent training alongside the RAF, the South African Air Force, and the Royal Australian Air Force. By April 1943, under the command of Colonel Arthur Salisbury, they were seasoned desert fighter pilots. Despite flying an aircraft technically inferior to the Messerschmitt 109, their skill ensured they destroyed Luftwaffe aircraft at a rate the Germans could not replace. On the afternoon of April 18th, 46 of their P-40s, accompanied by approximately a dozen Spitfires from No. 92 Squadron RAF providing high cover, were patrolling the coast of Cape Bon when they sighted a formation of Junkers 52s flying at wave-top level, returning empty to Sicily. German records listed 65 transports that day, escorted by 16 Axis fighters and 5 Messerschmitt 110s. The American pilots, observing the dense cluster emerge from the south against the setting sun, estimated 90 or more. One P-40 pilot later remarked in his debrief that the transports appeared to be the most beautiful formation he had ever witnessed, and that it seemed a shame to break them up, looking like it could have been a propaganda film. But break them up they did. The 57th split into 4 squadrons. One remained high with the Spitfires, engaging the Messerschmitt escort. The other 3 descended upon the transports out of the sun. What unfolded in the next 10 minutes became one of the most concentrated scenes of destruction in the entire air war. P-40s sliced through the transport V formations at high speed, firing, climbing, rolling, and then returning for another pass. The transport gunners and desperate soldiers, firing pistols and rifles from the transport windows, proved futile against the diving fighters. Junkers 52s exploded mid-air, disintegrated or crashed, burning, into the sea and along the Tunisian shoreline. Lieutenant R.J. Byrne described the spectacle afterward in a wartime 9th Air Force booklet, in words frequently quoted since. He recalled having a ringside seat for the whole show, writing, "All you could see were those big ships coming apart in the air, plunging into the sea, and crashing in flames on the beach." Captain James G. Curl, from Columbus, Ohio, stated that the planes were so densely packed that he missed his intended target and instead struck the one flying beyond it. Lieutenant MacArthur Powers of Inwood, New York, who had previously flown with the Royal Air Force at El Alamein and had 2 victories from that service, shot down 4 Junkers transports and a Messerschmitt 109 in that single afternoon. He concluded the day with a total of 7 aerial victories. The initial after-action claims were extravagant, with Americans reporting 146 Axis aircraft destroyed. Post-war cross-referencing against Luftwaffe records reduced that figure to 58 or 59 transports, 14 fighters, and 2 to 4 Messerschmitt 110s. The verified German losses amounted to 24 Junkers 52s shot down, with another 35 so severely damaged they crash-landed along the Sicilian coast, and 10 escort fighters destroyed. The American cost was 6 P-40s and a single Spitfire. For the German Air Transport Force, this represented a casualty rate they could simply not replace. The Afrika Korps on the ground waited for fuel that would never arrive. On April 22nd, 4 days later, a South African Air Force formation intercepted a flight of enormous Messerschmitt 323 cargo aircraft north of Cape Bon, escorted by Italian and German fighters, and shot down 16 of the massive 6-engine transports in a single engagement. Following this, daylight transport runs effectively ceased. Goring issued his night-only restriction on April 25th, but by then, it no longer mattered. The Axis supply system in Tunisia was completely broken. For every transport destroyed, panzers on the ground within the Tunisian perimeter ran out of fuel. Artillery batteries were reduced to a handful of rounds per gun. Infantry survived on severely reduced rations. When the final Allied ground offensive, Operation Vulcan, commenced on April 22nd and reached its climax on May 6th, with 400 artillery pieces delivering a 3,000-yard bombardment and mass fighter bombers preceding the infantry, the Axis line fractured because it had no means left to hold. Tunis fell on May 7th. Bizerta fell on May 7th. On May 13th, the last organized Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The count of prisoners swelled to approximately 250,000, with additional personnel rounded up in the Cap Bon pocket in subsequent days. Between November 1942 and May 1943, 2,422 Axis aircraft had been destroyed in the Mediterranean, representing roughly 40% of the entire Luftwaffe's force structure. More German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia than had surrendered at Stalingrad 3 months prior. Ordinary Germans back home, drawing parallels to Stalingrad, began referring to it as Tunisgrad. The name endured. Why then did the Luftwaffe, widely considered one of the world's most tactically sophisticated air forces, lose control of the Mediterranean so utterly within 6 months of the American arrival? The answer lay less in the aircraft themselves and more in the fundamental systems of command and control. The Luftwaffe in North Africa had been designed around the premise of direct support to its ground forces at the front. It had never developed a theater-wide command structure capable of disputing air superiority across hundreds of miles simultaneously. Its transport arm, already depleted by the airlift in Stalingrad over the winter, could not replace the skilled crews it was losing in the Mediterranean. Its Italian counterpart, the Regia Aeronautica, fought with undeniable bravery but operated aircraft that were a generation behind. And above all, a culture had taken root where junior commanders could not trust that their initiative would be rewarded. Göring and Hitler, between them, had hollowed out the essential trust that effective doctrine required. Against this disorganized system, the Western Allies had meticulously assembled what Cunningham had spent 2 years perfecting: a single theater air headquarters operating with 3 strictly sequential priorities: superiority, interdiction, close support, never reversed. Even if Rommel had foreseen this outcome, he had possessed no means to prevent it. A note discovered in his papers from 1942, written during a period of calm in the desert, almost precisely predicted what transpired. He wrote that in future battles, ground combat would be preceded by an aerial contest, and the outcome of that air fight would determine which side suffered operational and tactical disadvantages. He could discern the truth, but as a field marshal commanding an army group, he held no authority over the Luftwaffe, nor any direct influence on its decisions. By the summer of 1943, he was reiterating that the sheer fact of Anglo-American air superiority had thrown to the winds all the tactical rules that had once defined his reputation, and that every battle to come would be decided by that single factor. He proved, ultimately, correct about his own fate. On July 17, 1944, approximately 6 weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy and at the height of the Battle of Cannes, Rommel was touring the front as commander of Army Group B. That morning, he had visited the headquarters of the ISS Panzer Corps to consult with its commander, Sepp Dietrich, regarding the escalating crisis in the British sector. He departed for his own headquarters at La Rocheguyon that afternoon. His staff car, a Horch driven by Corporal Daniel, was on a road near the village of Saint-Foy Montgomery when Allied fighters spotted it. A Spitfire, most likely flown by Flight Lieutenant Charlie Fox of No. 412 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force, though a rival claim has been made by squadron leader Johannes Leroux of No. 602 Squadron, a South African flyer serving with the RAF, descended from the overcast and strafed the car with cannon fire. The Horch swerved off the road and overturned. Corporal Daniel was killed instantly. Rommel was thrown clear, sustaining a fractured skull and other severe injuries. He was evacuated to a military hospital, survived, and, after weeks of recuperation, was sent home to his village of Hurlingen, a few kilometers west of Ulm, to continue his recovery. He was still at home on October 14, 1944, when 2 generals dispatched by Hitler, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Mazel, arrived from Berlin with the choice Hitler had prepared for him. The investigation into the July 20th bomb plot had uncovered his name. One of the conspirators, under torture, had identified Rommel as a potential figurehead for the post-Hitler government the plotters had envisioned. Burgdorf presented him with the terms: a public trial before the People's Court, which would cost his family their home, his wife her freedom, and his son Manfred his future, or cyanide in exchange for a state funeral Indeed, the guarantee that his family would be left undisturbed. Rommel bid farewell to his wife and son. He put on his overcoat. He walked out with the generals to their waiting Opel and drove with them a short distance onto a side road just outside Hurlingen. There, he took the poison Bergdorf had provided. He was 52 years old. The official cause of death was announced as a cerebral embolism, attributed to his earlier wounds. The state funeral, held in Ulm, was exactly as Hitler had promised. The full truth of his death would not be disclosed in Germany until after the war. In one of the last letters he wrote to Lucy before his wounding, composed shortly after D-Day in June 1944, he reiterated, in the plainest language available to him, what he had first articulated about the African campaign 2 years prior. The enemy's air superiority, he told her, had a very grave effect on their movements. There was, he concluded, simply no answer to it. This conflict proved that the next war would be decided in the first 1,000 feet above the ground, an insight understood by certain men long before their peers. These individuals forged a new reality through bitter experience, performing an unprecedented task, finding the answer by simply doing the work.